Hello, everybody, and welcome to this CHEP Festival workshop on culture, creativity, and policy, building a network and sharing experiences. Today's session is really a discussion session, but we're going to do a quick introduction from myself and Joseph Owen on the Culture and Creativity Policy Network. Today's session is hosted by the network, which started in December, and following that quick introduction, we're really going to focus on members of the network sharing their experiences and insights on policymaking different contributions, and that's going to lead into a discussion on how policymaking connects with knowledge exchange, which is going to be led by CHEP's own Dr. Alex Reynolds. So a quick intro for me, I'm Dan Ashton, Professor of Culture and Creative Industries at Winchester School of Art and one of the coordination group for the network, with Joseph, who's going to take us through a quick intro on the next slide.
Thanks, Dan. So I'm Joseph Owen. I am a research fellow within the Faculty of Arts and Humanities. English is my background, but I'm also the specialist policy officer for the Faculty of Arts and Humanities. So I sort of bridge the research, academic policy engagement kind of divide. So we co-founded the Culture and Creativity Policy Network in December, as Dan says, and the kind of ambition or the aim of the network is to amplify creative policy making and cultural policy research expertise at the University of Southampton. So there's a lot of policy expertise at Southampton as an institution. We wanted to kind of generate a kind of focus towards cultural policy and creative approaches to policy making in particular. We've developed a SharePoint site, and you can click on some of those links on the slide, and that SharePoint basically hosts a resource library and shares opportunities. So as part of those resources, things like policy guides, so how to engage with policymakers or generate policy impact from an arts and humanities perspective. There's cultural policy consultations that have been recent or coming down the track. There's events. So we recently hosted an event, a dialogue session with Charlie Ingram from Coventry University, which was on headphone verbatim theatre as a means of kind of social science research. And we've also had a review session that looked at a class act, which was a report on social mobility and the creative in the creative industries. So we have a network page which you can contribute to. So there's a forum, there's a link in the chat there, and also there's the Public Policy Southampton external page, which showcases members' briefs and connections for external audiences. So that's the overview, and this was the third event and the second dialogue session that we've run as part of the network.
Great, thank you. So the culture and creativity bit really unfolds in two ways. So there's cultural policy making, so colleagues at university who might work specifically around cultural participation, cultural policy, cultural engagement, but we're also really interested in exploring creative approaches to policy making. So that might be, for example, colleagues in health, communities and education who use creative methodologies like verbatim theatre that Joe just mentioned, and other approaches to engage and inform policy making. So to that end, we have colleagues from Winchester School of Art, School of Archaeology and School of Biological Sciences, so a real interdisciplinary mix from across the university, to share their experiences and insights on policy making. So we're going to have 3 presentations of around 8 to 10 minutes each. Then there'll be time for some Q&A specifically around those presentations. And then, as I was saying, we'll have a kind of a more overarching discussion around cultures of policy making, how accessible it is, how useful it is, and how we might go about doing it. So the next slide is just a quick overview. So a big thank you to Claire, Vanessa and Charlotte for coming today to share their insights, experiences. And very swiftly then, we're going to do a swapping of screen sharing for Claire's presentation, In Your Bones, Community Voices Shaping Inclusive Skeletal Health Policy. Over to you whenever you're ready, Claire. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dan. So yeah, my name is Claire Clarkin. I'm from the School of Biological Sciences. I'm actually Director of Knowledge Exchange there, and I've been doing that for the last kind of 3 years. But by training, I'm a kind of a skeletal and cell biologist. So typically I'm in the lab wearing lab coats, using pipettes and that sort of thing, and not in meetings talking about policy. So it's slightly terrifying, but thanks Dan very much for the invitation to come and talk to you today about the early stages of my policy journey. So over the last few years, I've been working with Valentina Cardo, who I'm sure many of you know very well, and we've been really interested in looking to see how the experiments we do in our lab can be inclusive and may actually kind of lead to influencing health equalities. And that's kind of led to a lot of work linking to preclinical sex bias. So essentially, how do we do our experiments in the lab, and do they kind of impact skeletal health inequalities in a kind of population level? And coupled to that, I've also been doing some creative work. So I've been working with artists probably for the last 2 to 3 years, and kind of exploring creative approaches as a way to essentially engage the public more on issues around skeletal health inequalities. So I thought today in my kind of 8 minutes, I would split the talk up into my preclinical experimental bias work that I've done with Valentina, and then with the creative stuff, and then hopefully try and maybe pull them together a little bit at the end as well. So my research is essentially focused on sex differences in bone. So bone is sexually dimorphic throughout life, which basically means it's different in men and women. We see those differences beginning during puberty, where boys grow much faster than girls, and they have much thicker bones. And that kind of phenotype is thought to protect men from bone diseases in later life. So I had a research finding a few years ago where I found out that this is using preclinical animal models, which is predominantly what I use, and also cellular models as well. We found that the blood vessels in bone were different in female and male animals, and this is in normal and diseased. And this is really important because it suggests that processes that require blood vessels, such as fracture repair, are going to be driven by sex-specific mechanisms. So if we think about how we might want to be treating fracture, we should really be doing that in a kind of gender specific way. And so this is really where Valentina came in. So we knew in our lab that sex differences, the study of sex differences in bone, is really, really important. Myself and Valentina were really interested to see, well, how important is the study of sex to other people in the skeletal biology field, particularly those that are working with animal preclinical models. And so we had a couple of questions. We wrote a systematic review, and we had a couple of questions. Firstly, how common is it for the sex of preclinical models, or the animals, to be included in the journal article or abstract? So that's the terms female, male, female and or male. Are they being included there? And are they important to their research question and hypothesis? And also, for those that do report, is there actually a sex bias that exists there as well? So this is the data that we got. So on the left-hand side, in the pie chart A, what we basically got there is from around 45,000 manuscripts, only about 6% of those are actually reporting the sex of the animals they're using in the article title or abstract, which suggests that it's just not that important to their overall research question. And then if you look at the pie chart on the right, this is looking at bias. So we've got female mice essentially in orange and blue mice essentially in the blue, the male mice essentially in the turquoise and the blue. And what we've got there is actually a female bias. So skeletal biologists essentially using female mice more than male mice. And this is interesting because typically preclinical sex biases are actually the other way around. And this really is because of postmenopausal osteoporosis and animal models of that, whereby women are obviously most commonly affected. But this female bias that we see actually maps on to the lack of treatments that we have for male osteoporosis, and men are getting osteoporosis much more now as well in an aging population. So this is probably going to feed a health inequality related to gender there as well. If we go a little bit deeper into the literature and we pull out all of the osteoporosis data there, which leaves you with all the other studies around skeletal biology like development, fracture and exercise, that's where we actually start to see a male bias occurring. So we've got these kind of multiple layers of preclinical sex bias that exist, which will be potentially feeding onto health inequalities at a population level. So following on from that systematic review, myself and Valentina co-wrote a policy brief, which was a fairly terrifying process for me. And it's titled Bias in Bones. It's all about integrating sex into skeletal health and research policy to improve public health outcomes. The main things we're trying to get across there is to improve the understanding understanding of public health professionals around sex differences that underlie skeletal health, to prioritise the development of personalised sex-specific medicine. So that's certainly not happening at the minute. Men are being given treatments essentially optimised for women in their treatment of osteoporosis. And importantly as well, looking to influence research policy to standardise experimental design and reporting of sex to avoid preclinical sex bias. So we've been working quite a lot on that recently, and what this basically means is working with journals to make it mandatory for the sex of the animals that people are using to be included in the article title or the article abstract. This is a fairly basic thing to do, but journals aren't doing it, and we've just got that mandated in the Journal of Bone and Mineral Research, so it's now mandatory for people to include that information. Really simple step, but it'll really help us address these preclinical sex biases which are present. Okay, so very quickly, I'll just talk a little bit about some of the creative work that I've been doing, which aligns with this project. So this is In Your Bones. It started again around the same time, 2 to 3 years ago, working with Salisbury District Hospital and Art Care. So Leslie Self coordinates Art Care, which basically curates artwork for the hospital itself, and she also carries out training and workshops for hospital staff and patients. So we were matched up through the British Science Association Community Bodies project, which is essentially set up to drag scientists out of their labs and to interact and communicate more with communities. So luckily this year we got a bit of high funding, so we're able to get going with running some workshops, and the aims of these workshops were really to improve education access and healthcare equality, specifically in Hampshire through creative health engagement. The main kind of objectives of our workshops are to co-produce art-based educational resources with community members, artists like Leslie, and bone researchers like myself, and also to start thinking about how we can better co-produce policy information. So the previous policy brief I obviously wrote was very much evidence-based from scientific studies, but now we really want to bring in lived experiences of health inequalities in there too. So Art Care is involved, as I just mentioned. They've got experience in producing these personalised education packs, but also we got We Make Southampton involved, and Claudia Murg. She's a local community journalist. She's got amazing networks in Southampton, and she's got really good links both to local and national policy. So our workshops have just started. Actually, they started a couple of weeks ago. We had one last Saturday and we've got one this Saturday as well. So we're running 3 over the summer. We've got 30 people signed up. This is Claudia Murg actually using her contacts and her networks to get these people to the workshops. The way it's designed is the first half of it is a science and technology type presentation from me, and there's lots of opportunities for the workshop members to get involved in discussions, and then the second half is an art and creative workshop. Now these people aren't actually general public. I would say they've been handpicked by Claudia. They're kind of key members of the community in Southampton, and they have access to lots of different and diverse community groups across Southampton, where we hope to be able to disseminate our educational resources via them when the workshops are all completed. So this is some of the artwork that has been produced as the result of the workshop. So Leslie decided this time to, she's always in my lab stealing stuff, so she stole some Petri dishes and she gave the participants some clay, and they produced some artworks based on, you know, the discussions we've had about bone health over the morning, and also some of the images that I'd shown them as well. And you can see really beautiful artworks that have been produced, really different artworks too. And interesting, the ones in the bottom that are from the first group are completely uncoloured, and the top group there's loads of colour in there, so that's been really nice to see. And so following on from these workshops, the sort of stuff that we got off the back of them, we're going to have lots of artworks hopefully that we'll be able to present again and potentially exhibit. We've got transcripts, so Claudia in our journalism capacity has filmed all of the workshops, so we have all of the transcripts and all the conversations across all the community members that have attended. We've got amazing and beautiful photographs, and so Nick Sutton's there too, and you've got some of the photographs there, and I think that would make a really beautiful exhibition as well. And we've also got a poet's coming in next week, and he's going to be hopefully writing some poetry as well. So just my last slide now. So in terms of the emerging themes, these are kind of, I guess, early thoughts from the health inequality workshops. So I think my idea initially was that what we would have at the end of the workshops are these kind of personalised educational resources. So we'd have educational resources for postmenopausal women, for ageing men, for Black men, for Asian women, for trans people. That was kind of my idea. But actually, with the conversations we've been having, it's been much more, there's been some themes that have been emerging that are represented across multiple groups. So I think what we're probably going to end up doing is having a kind of larger educational resource that represents the views and the experiences of multiple populations, which has been really nice. There's been loads of discussions actually around traditional and cultural approaches to health, the value of social prescribing and complementary therapies. And for me as a scientist, this has actually been quite nice to hear, because obviously I'm in the lab thinking about developing new therapies that can be used as treatments, but I think there's a real, it has to be combined with, social prescribing and those sort of therapies as well. But overall, for me as a scientist, having this creative space with people really allows them to have a more open dialogue and free discussion around health inequalities, as opposed to me standing up and banging on about bone and bone health on my own for 2 hours. I think this has a much greater impact overall. And that's me. Thank you so much. So just the funders there, and thanks to obviously Claudia, Nick and Leslie for making these workshops possible as well. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Claire. Really fascinating insight into your research generally, but also that policy journey and kind of the value and potential of creative methods. We're going to group all the questions together and now move to Venice's presentation on Towards a Toolkit for Creativity in Policymaking. Thank you, Venice.
Thank you, Dan. And it was very inspiring to hear the first presentation as well. So thank you so much. So in this presentation, I should introduce myself first. So I'm Vanessa Vanik. I'm a senior lecturer in interaction design. I work at Winchester School of Art, and my interest in this was mostly coming from a games design practice and how games design can be used in policymaking, and lots of different research that I've been engaged with recently. So in this presentation, I'm going to share the work we've been developing since the first round. So it's still the first slide with a bit more of intro on the aim of this toolkit and what is this about. So we got some funds to develop this project, which was an impact fund from the first round, so 2024. And the aim of the toolkit particularly is to inspire and equip researchers and policymakers with creative, inclusive and impactful tools, especially those working in academic contexts, seeking to create policy that would influence through their own research and through that practice. So I think we can go for the next slide now. So our journey really started actually for this project when we met in the Knowledge Exchange and Enterprise Ideas Lab, and we were trying to understand how creativity could enhance research impact. So the whole premise of this is that we trying to move away from traditional methods like focus groups that might have some particular limitations, and trying to understand how creative methods could be used for policymaking. So the idea is that we would also, by the creative methods, try to understand how we could respond to urgent policy challenges, and try to also fill a gap on how you can do this, how you conduct this with real world scenarios. So we decided to collect some case studies for this toolkit, because we figured that by doing a little bit of this research in the beginning, there was a lack of even communication or understanding what can be done, particularly from what is actually good creative methods, what can that create, or art-based methods, what can that bring to the policymaking, and try to really have a conversation into these areas. So here I'm just quoting a little bit on, if people are interested in knowing a little bit more creative research methods and how it works. Obviously, we have Ellen Cara Creative Research Methods book, which is also part of the inspiration of this toolkit. So we can move to the next slide. Okay, so what is in the toolkit? Based on the research that we've been doing and talking to colleagues across the university, we've identified core principles for creativity and in policy making. And these are basically, so okay, yeah, that's it. So we have core principles, we have reflections on theory and practice, we have activity and examples, the case studies, as I said, some guidance, and also some insights on inclusivity, youth, and particularly evaluation. And then just to also mention that the structure of the toolkit also bringing how knowledge exchange happens, particularly in the policymaking context. So there is the writing of the case studies. Somehow they bring these combinations of problem, context, knowledge, the particular intervention and use, and how that's being applied using creative methods. So we can go to the next one. So the core principles that we identified are inclusivity. So embed marginalized voices from the start, openness to experimentation, make space for failure in play, co-creation, so collaborate with and not just for the stakeholders, reflexivity to consider power structures, positionality and values, translation, accessibility, so how to communicate emotions with clarity and also provide that since the beginning, particularly when designing workshops. Purpose-driven design, so thinking about matching methods and goals to a particular context and process over outcome. So there is not just the outputs, it's capturing that process. So we can go to the next one. And here we have some examples of creative policy activities in this toolkit, but much more than these three selected in the slide. And so we have poetry collage from Joseph and Nikki March. Joseph, you're here, obviously. Different ways to explore values. We have other ones that are not in there, but also postcards to policymakers. There are games as well. So Village Monopoly is a game. And there's also one using sound. So Poetry Collage would explore funding values through poetic form. So blending place, emotion, and inquiry. Village Monopoly, which is a board game to simulate local democracy and governance dynamics. And we have one for composition and sound, which again, bringing the idea of lived experiences, and also that research is not just a writing component, but also takes other formats. So some examples, and we can move to the next slide because I'm losing track of time as well. And we also have a section on working with underrepresented groups, and particularly I've attended to the Lemonade workshop, which was using a board game with young people and policymakers. And during that process was very interesting how the game helped to articulate discussions about futures, but also health inequalities at the same time, and created a safe space for policymakers and young people to have conversations about complex issues and also their own recommendations for policy, which was very interesting. And I think we can move to the next slide as well, because I can talk about when and how, but also how to evaluate. I think there are lots of questions as well. Obviously, the toolkit is just aiming to build that bridge, hopefully. But for example, even coming back from the Lemonade a workshop, which actually everything for me particularly started from there, to think about how do we evaluate the data that we capture, particularly when we're talking about gameplay. It's very difficult to see, okay, here, these conversations and decision-making are very important, and here it might become a very important component for policymaking. So the data sets that we have is very complex in terms of you have visuals, you have videos, you have lots of different things, different types of data. So this is one challenge that we encounter, but also the when and how to use creative methods in the policymaking process. And that was one of our motivations to do this, because we wanted to run a zine workshop, for example, and that was the wrong time in the research process to influence policymaking. So it is, again, to think about if it is an early stage ideation, if it is how you're bringing marginalized voices, how you're solving complex issues. And again, as I said, matching methods to orders. Here in this diagram, there is a diagram that Naomi added to the toolkit as well. They'll be viewing the call as well for evaluation, and this from CHEP. So I strongly suggest that if people want to have a look, that could be used as well in this particular context. Yes, we're all working together on this. Thank you.
Yeah. Vanessa and Emily did an amazing job of pulling together so many colleagues. So our third wonderful lightning presentation, Dr. Charlotte Joy from the Department of Archaeology, sharing experiences with UNESCO. Charlotte, over to you. Thank you.
Hi everybody. Thank you very much for having me. So I'm Charlotte Joy. I've actually just recently joined Southampton in September. I'm a lecturer in cultural heritage management, I think is the official title. First slide, please. That would be great. Next slide, thanks. So my experience is a little bit different because I've got a sort of semi-formal way of influencing and working with government. So hopefully this is useful and interesting, but it's slightly different from other people. So I was working for 10 years at Goldsmiths and working as an anthropologist. I worked for a very long time in Mali in West Africa. And at the time there was an opportunity to become a non-executive director at UNESCO's National Commission, the UK National Commission, and that was to advise and work with the UK government on 3 different cultural conventions, which I'll talk about in a second. And formally, it was set up as this kind of 20 days a year pro bono work across these 3 different conventions. And the conventions are the 1954 Hague Convention on Protection of Culture During Conflict, the 1970 Convention on Illicit Trafficking and Restitution, which is actually my expertise, much more than the 2003 Convention, which is the one I've ended up working on very closely. So maybe that's the first thing to say, is that you can work across different kind of specialisms. So in 2022, it became clear that the UK wanted to ratify this convention. So just before we go to the next slide, the 2003 Convention is the Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention, also known as the Living Heritage Convention. And that is a cultural convention that most countries in the world have signed, and the UK came to it quite late. And it seeks to identify, valorize, and help safeguard living heritage. So anything from kind of cooking traditions to traditional making to festivals to any sort of kind of living heritage tradition that happens. And it's important that it's ICH in the UK, not of the UK. So that would be also living heritage that comes from other parts of the world. Next slide, please. So I wanted to try and, because I've only got 8 minutes, to say what was useful and what can you do and what does expertise mean. So in my case, it was about networks. So I had a big network because I'd already done my PhD research, which was about UNESCO and UNESCO's effect in Mali. And I'd over the years built up this big network in Paris at UNESCO. So that was useful. And I could bring those networks to the DCMS and the colleagues that I worked with at the DCMS. I realized as well that because ICH wasn't my direct specialism, there was a need for skill. And together with a colleague at UNESCO, he helped me join this network, this international network of facilitators of the 2003 convention. So having these very direct skills, which is lots of training and ongoing training, etc., meant that I felt quite comfortable when I was asked specific questions about the convention, because as you probably know, cultural conventions are enormously complex and the way of speaking about them is a whole new language, etc., etc. So that was very useful. So to skill up, I think, is very important. And also research. I worked with the DCMS, but also through my own networks to just do a lot of research before we ratified the convention, speaking to other national commissions, speaking to other countries about their experience, and just making sure that we examined as much as possible all the different approaches to the convention so that the UK could think and position itself within that. So that wasn't just me, but together with colleagues at DCMS, that's what we did. And a top tip is about WhatsApp. Like if you do have really good connections, it's really helpful. So if I have a colleague at DCMS who needs an answer, I can quickly WhatsApp a colleague at UNESCO and get that answer, because policy, as you probably know, works very, very slowly and then incredibly quickly and then slowly again. And that's the problem, is that kind of, it's a very strange pace, I think. And being able to respond incredibly quickly has been really useful. Next slide, please. Yeah, and this is where, so creativity is obviously creativity, as in that kind of people from Winchester School of Art, etc. But I also think it's about intellectual curiosity and trying to really bring in as many different ideas and as many different ways of thinking about it. So because the ICH Convention is so broad, living heritage is such a broad subject, I could draw in experiences from lots of different perspectives. So, for example, a PhD student who is doing his PhD on Les Compagnons du Devoir, which are the traditional makers in France. They had a whole a network, a system there of apprenticeships, and he actually studied the stonemasons. But that brought me into conversations with other apprenticeships and guilds in the UK, and that the picture at the top there is him with a French mason who was one of the master builders of Notre Dame Cathedral, which then burnt down, which then allowed for, paradoxically, this huge training program to train many other skilled craftspeople. So that was part of thinking about how does this Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention interact with the UK's need for valorizing apprenticeships and hugely extending what we think and how we think about apprenticeships. I've been working with city and guilds and going to to lots of different meetings. So bringing that in. The olfactory storytelling toolkit, which you can see, that is a colleague at UCL, and she's been working for many years through this big project called Oda Europa to capture the smell heritage, the olfactory heritage of Europe so she's a scientist by background, so these really clever algorithmic scrapings of all sorts of historical sources to find out about smells in the past, but also incredible kind of chemical renderings of complex smells to try and safeguard them in museum collections. I can see the scientist is nodding. I don't really understand this, but the scientist understands it. Anyway, so it's when I first came to the DCMS saying, oh, there's this exciting project, they were a bit like, this it's not really what the ICH Convention does. However, over the last few years, you can see how it could potentially end up being much more part of what we potentially could do. So one very easy thing potentially would be for when we set up our inventory, because the UK is now going to set up an inventory of living heritage, we could just put one little thing which would be about olfactory or other heritage, which would then allow for this kind of broader. And actually what you see too is many more countries and many more institutions are actually getting excited about olfactory heritage because of its link to memory, dementia, all sorts of well-being, etc. So I think that would be my other big thing, would be to try and stay really curious, and also, do bring ideas along, and they might not stick at the beginning because people have got very kind of, as I said, strict timelines and things. But I think over time, and I've actually just set up a meeting with a key colleague in Paris, with the UCL colleague. So hopefully as well, a lot of what I do, I think, is just sort of like matchmaking between people I know, etc. Next slide, last slide. Yeah, this is about expert role. I think as academics, we know how much we don't know, so we're very uncomfortable, being expert on something, even if I've been doing UNESCO work and studying UNESCO for 20 years, but I'm still it's still embarrassing. Not embarrassing, but it's difficult, isn't it, to sort of, so embrace it would be my tip. Just, if you are then asked to do something and people trust you, then it's probably because you know what you're doing. So embrace it. This role I have has massively changed over time, just because I've had more and more responsibility. Some of the work I've been doing under this banner of the pro bono 20 days, but now I've also been paid to do bits and pieces of other work for DCMS because the role grew too big. At times, I am asked to go to represent the UK National Commission. At times, I represent the British government, so that's a completely different hat. So you have to take the lines of the UK government on certain things. And the last one, the bottom photo, is actually as an academic. So I think also you have to be very clear who you're advising and who you're talking to and which hat you're wearing when you're doing it. Because obviously my academic views would be possibly different from kind of taking a very specific line as given to me by the HMG colleagues. I think the key strength, if you're an expert advising government on policy, is your ongoing academic work. So I was really excited to see the toolkit. I'm actually going to Berlin in September to do a 6-month fellowship where I will be developing a toolkit about restitution and when museums should and how. So brilliant. I'd love to link up and talk to you about that. But yes, your ongoing research is definitely what keeps you relevant. I really think as well, you are not a politician or part of the political context. And so you have to understand it, but I think it's really, really good to have very clear lines between what you're doing as an advisor or as an expert and the whole politics that will be swirling around you. It's quite hard sometimes to make a difference, but it's really, really useful to have a clear idea of where that line is. And also, I think we all see different bigger pictures. So the bigger picture I think I can bring is this kind of academic bigger picture of what people in my field are doing, all the people I know in museums and heritage, etc., etc. Whereas I don't really know the bigger political picture, which is obviously what the colleagues at DCMS and others will be seeing around funding and political kind of priorities and such. So you're uniquely positioned to see your bigger picture, which is really helpful. And so I think you just can kind of sort of carry on bringing that. And also just that your work evolves and to share that as it goes along. And it kind of co-produces, the policy work co-produces your research, and the research kind of then feeds back into the policy. And that's, I think, 8 minutes.
Wonderful, amazing. Thank you so much, Charlotte. So helpful to hear about those different roles and responsibilities, and the idea of having different hats, and those really helpful tips. And I completely took the idea of aligning and responding to policy, but also creating a space for speculation and shaping those unknown policy agendas. So a massive thank you again to Claire, Vanessa, and Charlotte for sharing their insights and experiences, a really different and interesting mix today, but not hopefully for future interactions and exchange and conversations. So one way you can do that is via the Cultural and Creativity Policy Network's Viva Engage, which is just kind of a chat forum where you can ask questions and also share resources. The network has an external profile hosted by Public Policy Southampton, where you can see contributions in terms of policy outputs, contribution to consultations. We've got some work on methodologies that's going to be spotlighted. So that's on the PPS page. And then internally, we have the SharePoint. You can follow the link there, where there's various resources, as Joseph's introducing, and also where possible, recordings and slides from the different sessions we're doing. So hopefully the recording of this will be available there soon, and also via CHEP. A massive thank you again to Joseph, Alex, Claire, Vanessa, and Charlotte, and Naomi, and everybody for coming to today's session. Thank you very much.